here I will resume my discussion of the East Asian way of war, mindful of the dangers of a new conflict between the United States and the People's Republic, which would be, in my account, our sixth war against Confucian Asia. And as I've said it before, and I will repeat here just to make the point, that in the previous 5 conflicts, we won the Pacific War, fought to a standstill in Korea, lost the Chinese Civil War, lost the war in Vietnam, lost the war in Cambodia, and now we're proposing to go to war. And as I said, our track record is not that impressive. But in terms of understanding, in terms of the responsibility of the student of the Orient or of Asia, or what rubric you want to invoke here, our understanding has been incomplete. We have not made a good fist of this. And I mean broadly in our interpretation of Confucian culture as a political opponent. All the regimes we're talking about either are on the margin of the Confucian world, like Cambodia, or in very much part, integral to that Confucian world. And one of the reasons I emphasize my approach as Orientalist rather than area studies is that the Orientalist approach, whatever its limitations, and I think Edward Said overstated the case by quite some, but we tend to be very focused on 3 things that may be more marginal in contemporary Asian studies. One thing is language, classical and modern. The ability to read classical Chinese, for example, is central to this enterprise in a way I don't think that many of my colleagues, students of modern Japan, feel is important at all. Classical Chinese. Sanskrit is another issue because of the contrast. If you look at the political culture, the history of political culture of Cambodia, for example, the South Asian impact is enormous, and therefore it has to be calibrated in. You have to be mindful. So when I went to UCLA as a student, we did, the first year, the freshman year was, as a history major, was 3, because it was quarter system, so we had 3 quarters. And we did ancient, medieval, and modern, basically Europe. And then when we shifted to the sophomore year, the second year, we did India, China, and Japan. Now those are civilized concepts. These are, and that brings us to our second thing. Not only are we looking at languages, we're looking at, of course, texts, of course, but then we're looking at religious texts. Buddhism and Hinduism, Confucianism, if we will, by natural extension, the Quran and the Islamic tradition, which is part of this. I mean, the Orient extends from Morocco to Japan, from Mongolia to Indonesia, and a great number of those countries are Islamic. So religion is really important in a way that I don't think, again, is always that important to students of contemporary Asia. And I think it should be, but there we are. I mean, Confucianism, for example, is natural. Now, this is another twist to this, and the twist is that if you take a nationalist approach, in other words, you're like I'm a Japan specialist, and that's a national approach, how largely does Korea figure in that process? I mean, sometimes not very. China more, but still, China is China and Japan's Japan. If you're a student of Vietnam, and Vietnamese is a difficult language to learn, then Vietnam tends to be pretty much your intellectual world. Now, the Orientalist says, these are civilized entities. These are 4 pillars of the Confucian world. They are not separate. They are mutually influenced, and they share a conceptual, philosophic, religious history, which you can, in certain circumstances, ignore to your peril. Now, that's why I favor the Orientalist approach. So you've got textual traditions, civilized traditions, religious traditions, linguistic traditions, classic and modern, which is part and parcel of the Orientalist approach, and that's why I prefer it. When it came to explaining this next chapter in my intellectual life, you'll see why. Now, at UCLA, where I was an undergraduate, not very long before I arrived, there was a social science building erected, which the students promptly dubbed the waffle because of the shape and pattern of the windows. And in the basement of this building, palm trees and what have you, growing up in the shadows of the lighted ceiling, we would gather. And one of my classmates from another Catholic school, high school student, who was interested in Southeast Asia, and I was interested in was doing Japanese, he was doing Vietnamese. We'd meet there regularly and talk. And this was a way of refocusing. This turned out to be pregnant with the future because Vietnam turned out to be the key to this in a way that hardly any of my colleagues in East Asian Studies could even begin to imagine or care. Now, while I was with my friend discussing this in the 60s, the Tet Offensive happened. The Tet Offensive shattered the American illusions about what they were doing in Vietnam and how likely it was to end. I was registered. We used to meet almost daily during the Tet Offensive and saying, what is going on? How did this misconception blind Washington to the realities on the ground in Vietnam? And what, exactly, where is the expletive, where was the explanation of what was happening? Because there wasn't any really good one. Well, there was, but one had to be authentic. Now, where did all this lead? For one thing, it led to me, to put it in heroic context, my classmate went to Southeast Asia not long after this, visited Vietnam and Cambodia, and he caught one of the last trains to Phnom Penh before the Khmer Rouge cut the line. This is dramatic stuff. And you can see where Vietnam and Cambodia were real to me on this personal level, even though I was trained to go there, but I never fought, and I never was in the U.S. Army, although trained as an officer or ROTC at UCLA, and learned a great deal from it because one does, especially if one's going to be a second as American civil lieutenant. Just to put this in context, when we went to classes for ROTC, as I've talked to elsewhere, we were reminded daily that the danger of being fragged by one's own troops because one wasn't up to the job in some sense. High kill rate for second, they put it in perspective, doesn't it? So, all that fun. Now, this problem of the Tet Offensive. This led to, I think it was 1970, an extraordinary American writer produced Fire in the Lake, and I'll talk about her more. But in Fire in the Lake, which is a quote from the Analects, no, the quote from Book of Changes, about lake on fire being a lake on fire is a symbol of revolution, which was this point of it. Now, in this book, I encountered for the first time the ideas of Paul Mus, a French Orientalist, an expert in Indian culture, but also because his father was a master of a French colonial school in Hanoi, he had French classmates, and he spoke Vietnamese. So his take was, of course, to see the Cham culture in Vietnam, those great Cham towers, as a residue of effectively Hindu culture in Vietnam. And this clash of China and India, again, the civilized context, the clash of civilization, whatever it's meant in another context, between China and India, formed Southeast Asia. And so this although Mus's particular interest was in Southeast Asia, basically India, and he had Sanskrit, he had classical Chinese, and he was able to put pieces together, but that was his primary interest. Then the war came. Japan occupied French Indochina. Formally it kept the French in charge, but in fact they weren't, but formally they were. Not formality matters in a Confucian culture. French rule over Indochina was not officially ended until March 1945, when the Japanese assumed full control. That was the date that matters. And Mus made it clear that that was the date that mattered. So Mus was recruited because of his languages, not particularly athletic, but he parachuted into Vietnam at the bequest of the Allies to attempt to recruit Ho Chi Minh and his forces to support the Allied cause against the Japanese. And as a result of Mus's experience of encountering and negotiating with Ho Chi Minh, he realizes something extraordinary was happening in Vietnam that he had not guessed at, and it was a revolutionary tumult arriving. Ordinary peasants were alert politically in a way you would never have expected in passive people who toiled the soil. All of a sudden they had a revolutionary potential. This is all consistent with what I would later call Confucian Revolution. So Mus experienced this and wrote about it. And he wrote two books on the French experience in Indochina during this, one toward the end of it, not long after the war, and then again, not before, just before the French collapse. And these books were enormously important. The American, I mean, there was the translations, Mus lectured at Yale, and this all helped one get a perspective on it. And from these books and these ideas, and FitzGerald's work on Fire in the Lake, you began to get a picture. And then something happened. My dog barked. I was at home in Somerset, thinking about something else, and reading something else. And all of a sudden, it struck me that the revolution that had overtaken Vietnam in its precise forms could be inverted in reverse, the same process, happening the same month in August 1945. What happened in Vietnam was the beginning of a nationalist revolution. In August 1945, the arrival of the American power in Japan meant the beginning of a new mandate. Americans are the mandate holders. And you have a Confucian Revolution. Two of them, one nationalist, one, if you would, anti-nationalist, occurring in the same month in 1945 under the same framework. And this is what I would call Confucian Revolution. And it applies to the whole of the Confucian world. It explains, to my satisfaction, how political change happens, and it defines what the war aims will be should the People's Republic of China go to war with the United States. And therefore, this is all grist to the mill of the present, whatever its roots in antiquity. And that's why we get a vantage on what I call the East Asian way.